Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Several months ago, I had a conversation with Karen Carpenter. She's an employee, not that Karen Carpenter, but our Karen Carpenter is an employee who handles our communications and our membership database. Now, Karen is Buddhist, but she has many friends who are Christian. She came to me and said, "Rabbi, one of my friends told me about this wonderful program that they have on Wednesday nights at his church." I said, "Well, tell me about it," because she thought maybe we could do something similar here, minus Jesus. So she said, "Well, for starters, it's multi-generational, and that's just really important to get the generations mixing, and they do some study of text, and then they pray, but they pray with a lot of singing, and there's a time where people can socialize, and they eat." And I said, "Karen, we do that every week. It's called Shabbat. It's the most important part of our week." And Karen said, "Well, Rabbi, I've been doing the marketing in this synagogue for 10 years, and I have to tell you, I talk a lot about what our sisterhood does and what our learning center does, but do you know what I say about Shabbat most of the time? If it's really the centerpiece of what we do, I tell people what time it starts. So how is it possible that you're telling me this is the most important, wonderful program that we have, and it's every week, but we don't talk about it?" And I thought, wow, she's right. This week's Torah portion, we looked at this genealogy, but also in the 2/3 of the Torah portion that we'll save for other years, is the story of the first Shabbat. And we're told that God blessed Shabbat and God sanctified Shabbat. And Karen sent me on a journey thinking about how can we do more of that here, because I think we've got the schmoozing part down, and the food part. We're good at that. I even think we have the multi-generational part down. Often we have children in the building and young couples in the building, right? People of all ages, and that is a good mixture. But the praying, singing part, that's hard, right? We do it so much better than many communities, but Jewish prayer is really challenging. And in fact, it's not just Beth Torah that is trying to figure out how to make that a spiritually uplifting experience. This is a national conversation in our synagogues. How do we both adhere to a 2,000-year-old tradition and innovate? How do we make a 2.5-hour service spiritually uplifting for most of that time? How do we strike a balance between preserving Hebrew, which is the language of our people, but make the service accessible? And so this is a national conversation. There are all sorts of conventions and blogs. This is really a hot topic. And so I had this vision of making praying on Shabbat the spiritual highlight for our week, not just for our regulars, but for all of our members, or for any Jew in Dallas who wants to participate in the weekly joy that is the Sabbath. So I've been experimenting and trying new things for several months. Before I talk about what those changes have been, I think I owe you an apology, because I think the way I went about implementing some of those changes was uncomfortable for some of you. There are 2 words that describe the kind of job that I have. Sometimes we call this position a pulpit rabbi, and sometimes we call it a congregational rabbi. Each of those words has an implication about the rabbi's role. A pulpit rabbi stands up high above the congregation, completely separate from them once a week, and lectures them on what his or her wisdom is. But a congregational rabbi is down in the midst of the people, teaching, learning from their wisdom too, being a part of the community. And I was so excited about this vision and so afraid that you wouldn't like it, that I acted like a pulpit rabbi in implementing the changes instead of a congregational rabbi and inviting you to come along with me on this spiritually invigorating journey. So I apologize for the clumsy way I went about things, because while I have skill and expertise and vision and knowledge, this isn't just my service. We all have to pray together. My plan for making things better in our prayer life had two parts. The first was to look at the origins of the prayer life of our community. So this book is a memoir by Ron Gruen. Ron Gruen was the spiritual grandfather of the congregation. And here's what happened. When Beth Torah started, no one who was starting it knew how to lead a service. The only conservative congregation at the time was Shereth Israel. So the members who were starting Beth Torah called Shereth Israel and said, "Is there someone you can send us that can lead our services?" And Ron was the person who came to help them. So I want to read to you some excerpts from his essay about what those early prayer experiences were like. So he writes, when he got the phone call, "I herewith declare without exaggeration, that was one of the luckiest days of my life. It offered me the opportunity to make real what had been but an intermittent daydream, to make congregational, group praying less of a taxing, numbing experience. From my young life in Romania, through years in New York, and our life in Dallas since 1952, I was wishing for a prayer environment that allowed me time to recite the prayers at a calm, unhurried pace, where I could escape the constant boredom, no matter where I attended, and where I did not function merely as an audience for cantorial flourishes or choral exertions." In other words, Ron's original intention was to focus on the people praying, not the leader. He further writes, "I told the group of founding members that yes, I would conduct their Friday evening services, which was all of the service we had at the time, for a month, and I would do this for a month, at the end of which time I assured them some of them would be able to conduct services. I was quite confident about this prognostication. The others probably thought I was indulging in ordinary group flattery." So from the beginning, Ron had a vision of each individual davener being empowered to the point where he said, "You know what? In a month, I bet you can do this too." Pretty ambitious. That is a vision. Then he writes, "I made it my business to train service leaders. I asked some to lead right along with me from the first Friday evening service I conducted, and we shared the service. And usually, people would greet my invitation to sing along with embarrassed mumbling. So I would answer them with something like this: 'I know you're embarrassed to tears at the thought of raising your voice in public prayer. You fear your neighbor may hear you, but it's just us chickens here. No critical big shot is watching and passing judgment on how well you pronounce the Hebrew or how well you stay with the tune. So let's repeat the same prayer, and God will tolerate the repetition, as we will not be taking his name in vain. What can you lose but your self-respect?'" So he made this a casual learning environment where it was about mastering prayer, not performing a prayer perfectly. Then he also talks about introducing new tunes. "I encouraged members to introduce new melodies they may have heard in other congregations, or even from non-religious settings, informing the congregation in the process on the varied provinces of the melodies that are now thought of as Jewish normative songs." We already have so many positive aspects of how we pray together. We have a variety of service leaders, which means two things. One, that we have different styles of leadership, which I think is good because it speaks to the different needs of congregants. And it also means that the ability to lead services is not in one person's hands, because what happens if something happens to that person, right? We have divided our strength, and it's good. We also do sing along, and we participate, and I think that is good. And I like that we set a casual feeling in our congregation when someone makes a mistake, like she forgets to read the prayer for the state of Israel. Everyone helps and we laugh together and we move on because it's not a performance. And it also allows us to have children in our synagogue. We have a play space back there because how else are our littlest members going to learn how to pray but to be in our midst? But I think we should also give ourselves permission to try new things because I think that elevates our worship and keeps it fresh. So here are some of the things that I've been working on, and I want to make sure that you're aware of them. For starters, our service leaders, who are so wonderfully knowledgeable and dedicated. You should know that we're training 6 new service leaders this year. We are also offering 10 free voice lessons to all of our service leaders because all of us have something that we can work on in the quality of our voice production. We're going to have 5 workshops this year for our service leaders to help us gain in our leadership skills. For example, how do you effectively teach a new tune to the congregation? How do you break it down into pieces so that everyone can participate? And finally, we're talking about paying to send 2 of our service leaders to the conservative movement's Kol Tefillah. It started last January. Remember I said this is a national issue, trying to find a way to make davening spiritually compelling. So last year, all of the conservative communities gathered with their prayer leaders. Some of them were cantors, but a lot of them were lay leaders like we have here, and worked on these skills and these big questions together. We've introduced a new service on Friday nights. About once a month, David Stein has been playing the guitar, and Elizabeth and I have been harmonizing together. We think there's potential to turn it into a contemplative service as well. So it will complement Joyful Noise, our regular Friday night service, and now we're looking at adding something more contemplative. It needs a good name, by the way, so if you have a suggestion, please let us know. We've been introducing rhythm, trying to clap more or using this like a drum, because that helps our congregation sing in unison. Rhythm brings us together. And it also helps reflect the poetry, the lyrics of the prayer book, because the louder and faster we go, the more joyful the lyric, it's reflecting the joy of the lyrics, or the slower and softer we go, it may be reflecting something more plaintive. It gives dynamics to the service to use rhythm. And introducing new tunes helps keep things fresh, although it needs to be kept in balance with singing our favorite tunes. We have these Kavanah quotes. This week there are these pink cards that are glued into our Shabbat bulletin. So the idea behind these cards is that sometimes it's hard to get into the groove of prayer, so it provides a quote to help us, before we jump into praying, take a breath, think about what prayer means to us. And the cards are small enough that you can remove them and take them home if you want inspiration for praying during the rest of your week. We have these page flippers up front, which is not only a great opportunity for our Nir Bar and Bat Mitzvah students to gain ownership of the service, but it's good for us too, because we don't have to feel anxious that we're on the same page as the congregation. If we missed hearing the leader call the page number, or we've arrived late, or we were absorbed in our own thoughts, you can simply look up front and know where you are in the service. And we've been experimenting with space. In May, I came off of the bima because how we arrange this room and where we position the person leading prayer can be a symbol of the congregation's spiritual theology and philosophy. Well, I think we should be asking the questions of what does it mean, for example, to start with, what direction are we facing when we pray? Right? So around the world, Jews face toward Jerusalem when they pray. And it's something that helps us distinguish between a performance where we face an audience or address an audience when we give a Devar Torah, and prayer where we're addressing God. And every Jew around the world is directing his or her heart to the core, the heartbeat of the Jewish people, which is Jerusalem. And what does it say if everyone in the room is facing one direction, except one person gets to face the opposite direction? And also, it affords privacy during prayer, because sometimes prayer is emotional. People cry during prayer, people get angry during prayer, people may be secretly joyful during prayer over something they don't wish to share. And so when we look at each other, it can be very distracting, not only for the service leader, but for the congregants. And so by turning our faces the same direction, it allows us to be on our own personal journeys and not reacting or being influenced by one another. Then there's the issue of whether you lead being raised above the congregation or amidst the congregation. Where is the visual focus in our sanctuary? Is it on one person? Is it on the community as a whole? Or is it on the ark containing God's words and the holy light that shows us God's presence? Also, standing among the congregants, at least for me, allows me to hear better so that I can help us sing in unison. I can see very well from this height, but I can't hear you very well. Now, I know that not all of these changes are easy, but my goal is to echo the original spirit of prayer when Beth Torah first began on folding chairs in whatever space was available, which was to empower each individual for his or her experience and to put the focus on each davener and not the leader. And I can tell you a few ways that this might still be useful today. What if you arrive and you don't like that particular Shaliach Tzibor, prayer leader's style, and you're feeling irritated by what you would consider flaws in the way that he or she leads? If you have a sense of ownership of your prayer experience, you're not going to be as bothered by, oh, I hate it when so-and-so leads, right? Because it's your prayer experience. It's dependent on you. What if you arrive late and we've already passed by your favorite prayer? You should have the opportunity. You should have permission to go back and say that prayer or say the whole service at your own pace. What if you come to Shabbat on a particular day and you're in a really unhappy mood and you just need a quiet space to be reflective on your own life? Those are all good reasons to be the one in charge of your prayer instead of leaning on the leader to do it for you. But by now you may have a couple of questions, which is, Rabbi, if prayer is about the individual, why don't I just stay home? Right? I'll be more comfortable in my living room. Well, for me, I think a good analogy is a choir. When you hear a beautiful choral piece performed, sometimes you'll hear a very long, sustained note. It's impossible for one person to sustain that beautiful note, but as a group, we take turns breathing, right? So it sounds like the whole note or service goes along with the power of the whole choir, but really, individuals at certain points are catching their breath. They're taking a moment for themselves. And so too prayer. There may be moments where you want to be an individual for whatever reason, and there will be moments where you'll want to sync up with the community. And if your other question is, I don't really know which parts of prayer I can skip or miss or be out of sync with the congregation, here's a few good rules of thumb. If the community stands, even if you're not on the same page, go ahead and stand too so you don't cause confusion. If we're saying the Baruch Hu or the Kedusha, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, those are places where the halakha says we should be in sync. We should pause wherever we were in our own prayers and then rejoin the congregation. By the way, the halakha also says we should always say the Shema and Amidah even if we've arrived late, because those are the core central prayers. And if you don't know what those are, that's okay. Come and talk to me. I'm happy to show you. I've heard rumblings that some people are not happy with these changes. And with the exception of one person, no one's come and talked to me directly about it. They've sort of passed the message through Sid, who is our president, and through Jessica, who is our ritual vice president. And I think this happened for a couple of reasons. The first is that I didn't create a mechanism for regular feedback. I didn't let you know that it would be welcome to me or create a space where it would be safe to share. And if we really are looking at these big theological questions like, What is the role of the rabbi? What is the role of the service leader? What is the role of the individual during prayer? Then we need to create a space for conversation around it. I think the second reason is it turns out that people have a hard time telling their rabbi when they disagree with her, especially if she hasn't set up a regular mechanism for response. Maybe people are too angry to say something. Maybe they don't want to challenge my authority or hurt my feelings. But here's the thing. If I don't know how many people the changes are serving well or not serving well, I can't tell if it's doing a good job for the congregation or not. And if I can't talk to an individual and find out exactly what his or her discomfort is, then I can't try to address the discomfort. So if this hasn't been working for you, come and talk to me, because the only way we can arrive at a mutually beneficial prayer space is to have a conversation with one another. Not only does this week's Parsha cover the first Sabbath and this beautiful desire to sanctify a space in time, but it also talks about the first rupture in relationship. When Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, it was not good. It caused a conflict, right? Adam and Eve were banished from the garden, and God and humanity stopped speaking to each other for a while. And I'm sure that at the end of that episode, leaving the garden, Adam and Eve thought, that's it, our relationship with God is ruined, and God thought, that's it, I'm never going to be able to talk to humans again, we are in conflict. But the Vilna Gaon points out that Adam and Eve had one job, and that one job in the garden was to guard it. And he says, what should they have guarded it from? Creatures that could bring harm to Eden. And that creature was the snake. And that creature was the instigator of conflict. And they didn't catch it fast enough, and they assumed that the whole relationship was broken. That's just the end of chapter 3, though, and obviously this is a much longer book. So what happens in chapter 4 is that Adam and Eve have children. And those children go on to have a relationship with God, and their children's children do. Into every Eden, a serpent will crawl and cause friction, but it does not signify the end of a relationship. Conflict signifies an opportunity to grow and change together. I've learned from this experiment that I forgot to bring you along with me. And I've also learned that it can be hard for congregants to approach their rabbi. So what would make me the most proud of our community is not just that we are constantly giving ourselves permission to revitalize and experiment in our spiritual space, but also that our relationship with one another continues to be healthy through clear and transparent communication so that we can solve our problems together. So here's my proposal. It's very simple. If you have a stake in these changes, if you have a negative reaction to them, a positive reaction, or simply suggestions for what else to try, let me know. And I'm going to bring that group of people together for a discussion. And not just one discussion, but an ongoing conversation about our spiritual life. Because it's really important that we figure out how to continue to make Shabbat a vital part of our week that uplifts us spiritually. I love the tagline on our website, large enough to serve you, small enough to know you, but I have a new tagline to propose, playfully. This is Beth Torah, where we have a conflict, get mad at each other, realize this is normal in communal living, come back together to communicate and find a solution that meets most of our needs. I know it's not quite as pithy as our current tagline, but boy, wouldn't it be our own personal Eden if we learned to set that kind of culture here. Shabbat Shalom. I am going to lead a Torah study in the library for those that wish to study, and we'll continue with the Musaf service on page 428 for those that wish to daven Musaf.